I am famous for my alligator portmanteau, which I carry all of my important things. And I'm also very famous for my gavel, because I heard you're an unruly crowd. And my gavel and my shawl are in the Smithsonian. So let's begin. Tenacious, strong-willed, stubborn, sour old maid. These are the adjectives that have been used to describe me. I hold them all true and as a badge of honor. So how did I become all these things? Well, I had 86 years to do so. You see, I was born on February 15th of 1820 in the small hamlet of Adams, Massachusetts. Yes, I stayed there till the age of 6. Now, my parents were Daniel Anthony, who was a Quaker, and Lucy Reed, who was a Baptist. Oh my. It was frowned upon to have interreligious marriages back then. And believe me, my father's Quaker meeting house was no exception. As a matter of fact, when my parents got back from their wedding, my father had to go before the meeting house to make 3 concessions. He had to apologize for marrying the woman he loved. He had to agree to raise his children Quaker. And even though my mother never became a Quaker, she could no longer wear bright clothes or sing or dance. It is said a couple days before her wedding, she got in her finest gown and danced the night away. She also hummed lullabies to her babies. So you see, I get a little bit of my radicalness from my mother as well. So what was it like to be born Quaker? Well, we couldn't sing, dance, or have toys other than my rag baby, but I was educated equally to my brothers. This is very important, and you'll find out later. Yes, charity was abundant in my home, and education was paramount. Now, my father decided he was going to build a small cotton mill on Tophet Brook off of East Street in Adams. It was a small mill, 26 looms, and 22 girls between the ages of 8 and 16 worked in the mill. Do you think they're getting an education? No. Now, if they were far away, say upper state New York or Vermont, my father was responsible for room and board. So my poor mother, with her burgeoning family of 4 children already, had to also cook for up to 11 girls at a time who stayed in our attic. And believe me, it was a small, hot attic. So, yes, my father's mill was doing very well, and we also had a mercantile store in our house, as if my mother didn't have enough to do. In there, we sold the local goods. We sold eggs, lime for the stinky bathhouses, and also my father sold rum liquor. Oh, do you think the Quaker meeting house was happy with that? I think not. But he justified it. He said, well, I'm not drinking the spirit, therefore it's okay. Well, that was until one very cold night, a man froze to death inebriated. And even though he hadn't sold the liquor to this man, my father felt responsible. And from then on, he no longer sold liquor, and he started to have his employees sign a pledge stating they would not drink liquor while employed by him. For you see, a lot of these men are coming in and getting injured if they're drunk, and a lot of these children are coming in cold and beaten if they come from a horrible family. Now, my father's business was doing so well that we had the opportunity to move to Battenville, New York. There, he had a bigger mill and a bigger mercantile store. We had a fine house, and we were very prosperous. Now, I originally went to school, and I noticed that the boys were learning longhand. So I asked my male teacher, can I learn longhand? And he said, girls don't need to know it. Well, I went home and told Father, and he pulled me out of that school, and he started his own homeschool for the neighborhood, showing me when there's a problem, find a solution. Now, We were so wealthy that my older sister, Gula, and I were able to go to Pennsylvania to a boarding school. $125 each, a handsome price back then. But then, in 1839, the banks will be in a disastrous state, and we will lose everything to the recession. We will lose our business, we will lose our home, and we will lose everything we own, including property that my mother had brought into the marriage. Because you realize, people, once a woman married, you didn't have an identity. If you made money, it went to your husband. If you had property, it now belongs to him. And say he was a bad father, beating you and your children, you could leave, but your children were his property. Okay. So I started immediately working on women's property rights. Now, after we went bankrupt and penniless, we traveled around for about 6 years in upstate New York, and we eventually landed in Rochester, New York. This is where there's a bigger museum dedicated to me. Now, I met many famous people in Rochester. Frederick Douglass. We became so close with Frederick Douglass that when my father dies, he will do the eulogy. I met Harriet Tubman, and although my family never held a runaway slave, I knew what was going around in our neighborhood, for you see, the Quakers were the backbone of the Underground Railroad. But there's one person I met that would change my life forever. Her name was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. In 1851, I met a mutual friend, Amelia Bloomer, and Elizabeth was with her. Now, Amelia Bloomer most famously introduced me to Elizabeth, but she was also famous because she had a paper called The Lily, and in it, she published the latest fashion, a short skirt and pants. What do you think we call the pants now if her name was Amelia Bloomer? Bloomers. I tried wearing those pants, but I was realizing people were more interested in what I was wearing than what I was saying. So I hung them up after about a year. So what was so wonderful about my relationship with Elizabeth Cady Stanton? Well, the kids nowadays say BFF, best friends forever. She was my best friend for 51 years. Now, Elizabeth, she could write a speech. And I became very good at giving a speech. So we made a wonderful, wonderful team. Unfortunately, Elizabeth will have 7 children. Do you think she's out there on the road with me while I'm sending my message? No. As a matter of fact, no one is on the road with me. All my friends are getting married and having children. I even wrote letters chastising them. And I finally told Elizabeth, stop. So on the road, what was it like? Well, in the winters, it was freezing cold. In the summers, it was deadly hot. Can you imagine walking around in garbs like this in the summer? The inns I stayed in were horrible. The food was awful. Bed bugs were my friends. But the only things that bothered me were the loneliness and the fact that there were women that did not want my help. There was actually a faction in Boston, Massachusetts, the anti-softs, who said that it would break up the integrity of a marriage if a woman could vote. And besides, wouldn't she just vote the way her husband told her to? So, I have this wonderful relationship. I've dedicated myself now to women's rights. I had taught for a while to help with the finances of my family, but I never liked it. Plus, I was only being paid a quarter of what a male teacher was being paid. So now, full force, women's rights. But the West is being opened, correct? There's talk of the Transcontinental Railroad. We have territories and states coming in. Are they going to be slave or are they going to be free? Now, two of my only two brothers, Daniel and Merritt, had moved to the Kansas territory, and I was getting first-hand reports of the bloodshed in that county over the slavery issue. At home, my family started to have abolition meetings, and I started burnishing posters saying, "No union with slaveholders." And a bunch of us started to do a tour making people aware of abolition. If I thought being solo on the road was tough, we had so much animosity towards us. We had stones thrown at us, eggs thrown at us, and then once in Rochester they burned an effigy of yours truly and walked it down the streets of Syracuse. We actually even had to huddle in one of the places we were to speak for fear of our life. Now, we all know in 1860, a tall, lanky man is going to become president. Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator. Do you think I'm happy? I'm going to give you a hint. I am never happy with politicians and their policies. Why didn't I like Lincoln, though? Well, nowadays you call them posers. And I felt Mr. Honest Abe was a poser because when he first got in, he was A-OK with the Fugitive Slavery Act. He did not want the black man to have citizenship. It was only as the war progressed that all of a sudden he became the great emancipator. Now, shortly after his inauguration, there will be a secession of several southern states. And then in 1861, they will bomb one of our Union bastions, Fort Sumter. The Civil War has begun. Now, during this, again, I'm working for the slavery rights. It's all about slavery. I put everything else on the back burner for now. As we all know, the Civil War ends with a Union victory. Mr. Lincoln will be assassinated shortly afterwards. And now is the problem. What do we do with these southern slaves coming north that are uneducated and homeless? Well, the first thing we wanted to do was reenact the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 into an amendment, the 13th Amendment. Now, this is a little tricky, so hang on with me. There was a Boston group led by Lucy Stone. They felt that it was the Negro's hour. And so the 14th Amendment, which allowed a man to vote, and the 15th Amendment, they were for that. They felt, let the Negro get in, and surely the 16th Amendment will let women vote. We, on the other hand, in New York, we said, no. I have no problem with the Negro voting. But I've been working 17 years for women's rights. I want to go in together or me first. We will have such a dissolution of our unions, New York and Boston. And unfortunately, Frederick Douglass is going to side with the Boston group. So what did Elizabeth and I do? We started the National Women's Suffrage Association. Well, Lucy Stone in Boston said, I'm going to start the American Women's Suffrage Association. I was so upset. What I've worked for all my life, and now we're splintered. As a matter of fact, we will not talk for 21 years. Yes, I held out an olive branch on occasion, but the Boston group would not hear of it. And then in 1890, we will join together and make the National American Women's Suffrage Association, of which I will be president. Did we get that? Because it took me a long time. Okay, so after that, I decided in 1872 that I was going to vote. The candidates were Ulysses S. Grant and Horace Greeley. He was one of those people in Boston. I said, I'll cut off my right hand before I throw my support to that man. And so I decided I was going to vote for Ulysses S. Grant, even though I didn't feel he was very competent either. So on November 1st, myself and a group of my friends, including 3 of my sisters, 14 in total, we go down to the barber shop to register. There's going to be 3 men behind the podium. There's going to be a man named Marsh, a man named Hall, and I remember poor Beverly Jones. We go to there, and they say, "You can't register." But I was prepared. You see, there was a man named Francis Minor that had come up with a solution to this problem, saying women are naturalized citizens. Therefore, they should have the right to vote. Well, we convinced those men to allow us to register. They will do time for allowing me to register. As a matter of fact, their trial will be right after mine. So I register. 4 days later, I cast my ballot. I run home. I write a letter to my best friend, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and I say, "I've gone and I've done it." November 15th, I get a knock on the door. It's a deputy marshal. He's come to arrest me. "Please, Mrs. Anthony, when you have some time, could you come down to the police station so I can arrest you?" I said, "Do you do this to your male prisoners?" And he said, "No, we handcuffed them and put them in the paddy wagon." I just put my hands out, but he said that will not be necessary. And he didn't have the paddy wagon, so he had to get a cab to bring me to the station. And as I got in the cab, I said, "This is the only free ride I'll ever get from Uncle Sam." So now I'm in jail. I want to stay in jail. Why? I'm going to tell you. Because if I'm in jail, I can expedite my hearing by writing a writ of habeas corpus to go directly to the Supreme Court. I wouldn't have to deal with any red tape. Unfortunately, my lovely lawyer, Mr. Selden, didn't want to see a good woman in jail, and he paid the $1,000 bond. It's a lot of money back then. So now I'm out. Well, trust me, I wasn't sitting home eating bonbons. I was going across the country because, you see, my trial won't be for 6 more months. I had 22 lectures alone in Monroe County on I am a citizen, I should be able to vote. So now my trial is going to happen in June of 73. The Honorable Judge Ward Hill, a misogynist, is presiding. He instructs the all-male jury that I am guilty, that they will find me guilty, and I am so confident that you're going to find her guilty, I'm not even going to poll you afterwards to see how you voted. I called it the trial that wasn't. It was a sham. And so now I stand in front of Mr. Ward Hill, and he proposes a $100 fine. I want to go back to jail, people. But he knows my trick. So he passes me the fine, and he says, "Do you have anything to say?" I say, "Oh, I have many things to say. You've trampled on my civil, judicial, national rights. You've trounced on all of them." And at the end, I say, "I have no intentions of paying 1 penny of your unjust penalty." And I never did. Now, also during this time, I have the opportunity to have my own newspaper. And believe me, anyone who was anyone had a newspaper. That was the only way to really get your message out. It happened because I was on a trip across the country, and I met a George Francis Train. He was handsome, he was wealthy, he was a copperhead, and he was in for any unjust cause. And he also was supporting the IRA in Ireland. All my friends said, "Don't do it, Susan, he's a charlatan." But I wanted to get my message out, so I did. Well, shortly afterwards, Mr. Train is going to get arrested in Ireland, and he can no longer back my paper. It will be in circulation for 4 years, and I will go $10,000 in debt. All my friends say, Susan, claim bankruptcy, because as a single woman, I can do that. I said, no, I refuse. It took me 6 years, but I paid back every penny of what I owed. Now, what was in the revolution? Well, articles to make women's lives easier, but also the biggest one was restalism. Do we know what restalism is? It's our term for abortion now. Because you see, Madame Restel was performing illegal abortions, and women were dying people. So, and as a Quaker, I believe that God's light is in all of us. I was against abortions, and every female doctor that was now coming out of college was also against it. So I learned a lesson with my paper, but it greatly saddened me that I had to let it go. So now I'm getting older. I'm still the president of the National Women's Suffrage Association, but I know that I'm going to have to pass the torch eventually. So I decide when I am 80, I'm going to allow Carrie Chapman Catt to become the president. There's 2 women I love, her and a woman named Alice Paul. So when I turn 80, I hand over the reins. But again, I'm not sitting home just sipping tea. I'm going now to international suffrage associations in Europe. I'm going back and forth across the country because I want the right to vote. But I'm starting to realize I will never see it. As a matter of fact, I will die 14 years before the 19th Amendment is ratified. But I have hope that it's going to happen. Now, on my 86th birthday, all of my lovely girls, I call them, they each came to me and placed a rose on my lap. And I make my most famous speech where I say, with women such as you consecrating your lives to the cause, failure is impossible. That's my quote that everyone knows me for. Failure is impossible. Unfortunately, a month later, I will die of pneumonia. So, but I have hope because I know we're in capable hands. Women are not getting married right away. They're going to college. They're delaying having kids, and they are truly invested in the suffrage right. So there was Carrie Chapman Catt, and there was a woman named Alice Paul. Now, Alice Paul had been in England and Scotland for a while, and she had been arrested with the Pankhursts. Emmeline Pankhurst was the famous, she was kind of like the British version of me. So she had learned some techniques while she was in jail over there, such as hunger strikes, to try to appeal to become a political prisoner. You'd be given better rights. So when she comes over here, she joins the Americans. Now, Carrie Catt, she wants everything to be done by the book, work with the senators, work with the congressmen. And Alice Paul is saying, I'm done with that, people. We need to get more aggressive. So what she does is she forms the Silent Sentinels. They're going to be a group of women for 2 years. They will stand in front of the White House and protest. Suffragettes are the first people to ever protest in front of the White House. They don't say a word, they just stand there. Now you must realize that the police are told not to protect them. As a matter of fact, Alice Paul had also organized the famous Women's Suffrage March the day before President Wilson became president. Over 5,000 women marched. Over 500,000 people came to see it happen. But again, the police were told not to protect us. And so 100 of us ended up in the hospital at the end. And you know who helped us? The Boy Scouts. They made a human chain so that we couldn't be approached. But now with the Silent Sentinels, one night they're going to get arrested by the police. They're going to be beaten. One woman is hung up with chains to the ceiling. And these women are no spry chickens, some of them. And they're well-off women. So what does Alice Paul say? Hunger strike. And so the girls did have a hunger strike. Now, the warden says, force feed them, which was a barbaric act back then. And so they force fed the girls. This got out to the public, and they were immediately told to stop it, and then we eventually were released. So, what is going to happen? Well, in order for an amendment to be ratified, you have to have 3/4 of your states ratify it. At this time, we needed 35 states. It all came down to the state of Tennessee. Trust me, that is not the state that you want determining women's rights because it's considered a southern state. So Carrie Chapman Catt, she is there. As a matter of fact, in her hotel room above her, Jack Daniels has a room, and they're giving free shots to anyone who will vote down suffrage. Really? So, it passes the Senate. Now comes the Congress. Now, if you were for suffrage, you had a yellow rose. If you were against suffrage, you had a red rose. So she's counting the roses. 1 vote short, she sees. It comes down to the last man, a 26-year-old man named Henry Burns. He's got his red rose saying, and he gets up and says, "I." His colleagues look at him. Well, Mr. Burns got a letter from his mama the night before, and she said, "You passed the rat for Carrie Catt." And so he did. I guess he'd rather deal with his colleagues than his mama. Smart man. Her name was Miss Phoebes, and I think there should be statues all over in her honor. And so, on August 26th of 1920, almost 100 years after my birth, the Susan B. Anthony 19th Amendment will be ratified. And it was called that because I did much of the work for that ratification when I thought that perhaps it would have been the 16th Amendment. Now, I also have coin after me, stamps. Not bad from a little girl from the small hamlet of Adams, Mass., right? So I always look at it at this. Us old ladies, we planted the seed and we watered it so the younger woman could enjoy the bloom. And I always say, organize, agitate, educate. That is my battle cry. Now I want to leave you by saying this is an election year. I don't care how you vote, but vote. Especially you women. We worked way too hard. People say we got the vote. We took it, people. Thank you. Now, I'm fascinating, so you must have tons of questions. Yes?
Did you coin the term agitate, educate? How would it go, the three of them?
It's organize, agitate, educate. And yes, that was my battle cry.
Okay, so I know the carpenters union use that as well.
Well,
Yep.
thanks to me.
Thank you.
Another thing I've done. What else? Come on. Yes.
Were there any people in the government who showed some support for you?
Ironically, Kansas was originally supposed to be the first state to ratify, and that's why I adopted their state flower, the sunflower, because we thought they'd ratify first. My 2 brothers were there. It ended up being Idaho, Utah, and 1 other state. Can you guess why the Mideast states were just fine? Because you're going across country in covered wagons. Your wife is your partner, right? So they were already voting in local elections. So the men, they said, give them the right to vote. So it depended on the states. Now, you must realize that a lot of states didn't want suffrage because they associated it with temperance and eventually prohibition okay? Because you have immigrants coming in that love their beer, and you have foreign interests that want to sell their alcohol. So this is why it was so hard to pass suffrage. Okay. Any other questions?
Did you have any interactions with John Brown, who was active in the abolitionist movement?
I'm going to tell you something. My two brothers were in Kansas, where originally that's where John Brown started off. Now, my two brothers fought for the Union, which is usually against Quaker beliefs, but they felt strongly about it. And my youngest brother, Merritt, aligned himself with John Brown and fought beside him in Kansas. Luckily, he didn't fall into Harper's Ferry. Now, when John Brown was captured, I looked at him as a martyr. I had respect for what he did. As a matter of fact, I will help his widowed wife and orphan children when he dies. I thought someone over here had a question.
Yeah, the second question. You touched upon the abortion issue. I was just curious, historically, how that played out. I know you mentioned as a Quaker, this was it's not the right way for women to behave.
Right.
But the right to have the abortion.
Well, it doesn't come to fruition until Roe versus Wade, really, when it becomes, legal to have an abortion. You got to realize back then it was dangerous to have an abortion. My faith, I was extremely against it. I was definitely pro-life. Yes.
Did you ever have an opportunity to have a relationship with anyone, or did you just...
Well, I was considered very handsome in my day. And I did have several propositions. As a matter of fact, this one wealthy man, on the cold winter nights, he would come up to the sleigh after one of my lectures, and there would be hot coals in the brazier, and I'd have a warm ride home. And he ruined it by asking me to marry him. I had several suitors. I never married. Anything else? How did I come up with $10,000 to pay off that debt? My lectures. You see, I was hated in the beginning when I started to go out solo. In the middle, I'm getting recognition, and even if you don't like me, you have respect for me. And so people were coming to hear me speak, whether I was a entertainment or people were there to hear me. That's how I paid with admissions to my lectures. I sold tracts of information like pamphlets and things to pay that $10,000 debt back. Anything else? I had my sister Gula ahead of me, then came me, then my sister Hannah, then my brother Daniel. And when we moved to New York, there will be Mary, Merritt, and poor Eliza won't see the age of 2. Now, all of my family, again, I always say I would love to have sat in on the Anthony family talking about social causes. Because Daniel became an editor, Mary became a superintendent of school, and any extra money she had, she put towards my cause. I had very wealthy friends who also helped me out. That's why I was able to keep the revolution going for 4 years. I had wealthy benefactors. But in the end, they knew it was a sinking ship. Anything else? Yes?
Did you write any books?
Oh, did I write books? I wrote 5 volumes of the women's suffrage story. 5 thick volumes.
And are those available?
Yes. We have them at the museum. How many of you been to the museum? We're going to give free tickets away at the end for admission if you'd like to go. Again, I lived there the first 6 years of my life.
Do you have any regrets?
I wouldn't call them regrets because they made me who I was. I do regret aligning with Mr. Train. And there was a woman named Victoria Woodhull. She was the first woman to run for the presidency of the United States, at the same time as Ulysses S. Grant and Horace Greeley. Unfortunately, she was in jail, so she couldn't vote for herself. Originally, I liked her very much, but then she started taking over my meetings. And she was very radical. She believed in free love. She lived with her husband and another man. Her and her sisters were the first women stockbrokers on Wall Street. She was intelligent, but she was a loose cannon, so I regret that. And I also regret, during the Civil War, I put women's property rights to the side and women's rights. And when the war was over, anything I had gained for women's property rights had been receded back. So I learned, never wait for a war to abate. Now, when the Sentinels are protesting, it's during World War I, and many people find them unpatriotic. But I learned from the Civil War, I think I would have been right there with them. Yes?
Did you and Frederick Douglass ever become friends again?
We did. After the 21 years, we did become friends again, but it was never the same. That's another regret I have.
What happened to the group in Boston? Did that just continue?
Well, they merged. They merged with us to make the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Yes. So, my first cause was temperance, which started when my father wouldn't allow his workers to drink anymore. My second cause was abolition. Included with that was women's rights. You must realize I met Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1851. And that's the first time I ever entertained women's rights. So that became my cause till the end. And I really did have blinders on. I was politically pragmatic. Whatever side offered us the most is who I aligned with. For example, when Ulysses S. Grant and Horace Greeley are vying for the presidency, at least the Republicans, we called it, instead of a plank to speak on, they gave us a splinter. But at least they gave us a splinter. The Democrats didn't want to do anything with us.
What about your legacy as president today? The National Women's Association is still present?
No, that turned into other things. Alice Paul, she started the, she lived until the 60s, 1960s, and she was involved with a lot of civil rights and other causes. So there was no need really for the National American Women's Suffrage Association anymore because we finally got it. Anything else? Now, I saw some of you eating some of the treats. A little dry, aren't they? But this is directly from the 1880 Women's Suffrage Cookbook. They're called coffee cake. They just called it coffee cake, but it's in the form of like a biscuit. And one other thing, when I would go to Elizabeth Cady Stanton's to watch her children so she could write my speeches, all I mention is, I made puddings today. I made puddings today. And aren't there 5 pages of puddings in that cookbook? It was a big thing back then, I guess. Any other questions?
I was wondering about the women's suffrage movement in England. In the United Kingdom.
Well, our gals over there were much more radical than us. As a matter of fact, they would take toffee hammers and they would walk past windows and just bang them out. Then they decided, let's stop bombing things. And then one woman, she decided during a horse race, one of the first ones to be filmed. She's in her white, she's standing there with her sign, here come the horses, and she steps in front of them, and she's trampled to death. Yes. So they were more radical, but ironically, they didn't get the vote until several years after us. Any other questions?
I was just curious when the Prohibition Amendment was passed.
Yes.
Was that before or after the 19th Amendment?
Well, it was the 18th Amendment, so before it.
Before.
The only amendment repealed. Any other
so
questions?
far.
So far, exactly. Nothing else? No one's going to stump me today? I'm very...
Did you have any contact with the UK groups?
More so Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Her daughter moved to England, and she was over there often. I did know who they were, and when I went over there for international suffrage associations, I did meet them. But Alice Paul was really the one who was friends with them. Any other questions? Well, I guess I did my job.
Thank you.
Now,